Kings Road, funny thing, I started out from the point of view that two of the most interesting bands that ever came out of this country in the post-war era both started down the Kings Road. It's the Rolling Stones in 1962, they were living at the Grossi end of it, and then the Sex Pistols got together in Malcolm McLaren and the Westwood Shop in 1975, also at the Grossi end, the World's End end of it. So you've got that strand of it, but the other end, which is, you come out of Sloane Square Station and you're at the eastern end of the King's Road, and that was always the posh end, and that's where you've got Peter Jones and you've got the Royal Court Theatre. And Mary Quant started her groundbreaking boutique in 1955 on the King's Road called Bazaar. The directors and writers who were at the Royal Court Theatre in 1956, the season they discovered John Osborne, those directors went on to basically the whole British kitchen sink film explosion in the late 50s and early 60s. Those are people who are working at the Royal Court. Tony Richardson, Lindsay Anderson, Carol Wrights, people like that. And many of the plays that started out there then were filmed, such as obviously Look Back in Anger, but also things like Taste of Honey, and many, many more. The Knack. A lot of things that are thought of as quintessentially 60s productions. If you watched anybody on Top of the Pops in the 60s and 70s, and you thought, where did they get those clothes that they wear? Usually it was boutiques down the King's Road, places like Hung on You, Granny Takes a Trip, Alcazura. Mark Bolan was shopping there. The Rolling Stones were continually wearing cloth that they'd got there. If you wondered where can you get the most extreme platform boots in history, in say 1972, which the musicians were wearing on television, there was a shop run by a guy called Terry de Havilland, and it was one of the best names for a shoe shop you could possibly. It was called Cobblers to the World, and he served everybody. I interviewed people like John Pierce, who one of the co-founders of Granny Takes a Trip boutique. They opened in '65, and I said, "Well, who are your customers?" And he just went, "The Beatles, the other lot, Warhol, Stamp, Bordeaux, everybody." And he was right. They did. They knew everybody when they opened. One day, this Italian film director wandered in 1966 and bought a beaded dress because he was looking for something to put on one of the people in his new film, and it wound up on the poster as well. And that was Antonioni, and John Pierce sold him this beaded dress, and the model Verushka wore it, and that's the one, if you know, David Hemmings playing this David Bader character, standing over a model who's on the floor and photographing. That's the poster for Blow. That's where it came from. Rocky Horror Show started out as a theatre piece in the tiny little theatre upstairs at the Royal Court in front of 60 people, a room about the size of this, and it exploded, absolutely exploded. 1973, ran on the King's Road in a converted theatre down the road for 3 years, during which time they went out to the old Hammer Studios at Bray and made the film, which then took it all around the world. The more I found out, this book is 530 pages long. It's insane. It could have been 4 times that length. So many things. Germaine Greer wrote the female eunuch while living upstairs in a sort of hippie squat called the Pheasantry. Downstairs, this night, a couple of years earlier, Eric Clapton was living there, sharing a flat with Martin Sharp, who's the guy from Oz magazine. If you've ever seen the psychedelic poster they did of Dylan with "Blowing in the Mind" written on it, that's Martin Sharp, and he drew that on the King's Road.
And even like 100 years before
mad.
then, when before the Rocky Horror Show, you've got Oscar Wilde living on Pike Street and seeing Helen Terry dressed as Lady Macbeth stepping out of her carriage every day. So I know I'm very keen on the idea of psychogeographies, of sort of histories repeating themselves in one place. And
it was a safe space. It's no surprise to me that, for instance, Quentin Crisp, when he was walking the streets in the 1930s with his hair hennaed, looking and makeup, full face makeup, most parts of London, and he was getting his head kicked in.
Yeah.
But he lived in Chelsea for 35 years in one room because that was where he felt safe. It's where Aleister Crowley moved there in 1922 and wrote Diary of a Drug Fiend. It was an artist, the first proper purpose-built artist colony in the late 19th century in the whole country. So you've got Rossetti, Swinburne, people like that living there. Bram Stoker was living there when he wrote Dracula. He once actually jumped into, just right by the river, he saw somebody try to commit suicide jumping off a Thames pleasure barge going past, middle of winter. And if you've ever thought of throwing yourself into the Thames from the embankment, I wouldn't like to try it any time. Very brave guy. He got a medal from the British Humanitarian Society for trying to save this guy. He actually dragged him out. The guy died later on. But everybody was there. Mark Twain, Edgar Allan Poe went to school there. Jane Austen corrected the proofs of Sense and Sensibility while she was living just north of Sloane Square. I interviewed Christopher Lee for the book, and he lived just off Sloane Square for most of his career.
Did he know that Bram Stoker story, or did you tell that to him?
I don't know. Because the thing about Christopher Lee, he was such an erudite, it wouldn't surprise me if he knew that. Yeah. He told me that when he moved there in about 1961-62, a good friend of his was living 2 doors down. That's Boris Karloff. So they're just behind Peter Jones in a quiet square. You've got 2 British giants of the horror film world living right there. There's the James Bond connection, which always fascinated me. So Ian Fleming writes them in the same year at Casino Royale, the first one, 1953, I think. That's the same year he's having his first child christened at Chelsea Old Church. James Bond himself lives in an unnamed square off the King's Road. Just 5 years before he got the part, Sean Connery was living at the grotty end of the King's Road when he'd first come down from Scotland. John Barry was living just off the King's Road in the 60s with Jane Birkin, and that's where he was writing Goldfinger and all the theme tunes. It goes on and on, it's absolutely mad. And John le Carre set, all the Smiley lives in a road off the King's Road, and Kim Philby, the real life spy, was living just off the King's Road until he ran away to go and commune with Stalin, or the ghost of Stalin. By then he did it, I think, 62. So, as you say, psychogeography, things piled on top of each other. Yeah. The fact that the pub where the Sex Pistols auditioned John Lydon, like the 3 of them in McLaren, that's the Roebuck at World's End. And that was the favourite drinking pub. You've got Francis Bacon in there. His studio was just up the road near Southgate Tube Station. Peter O'Toole was drinking there. This was a very rough pub. They would have fights there, but you've got the worlds of film, theatre, art, but also something very down and dirty. Yeah.
And there's still, in the 70s when I did Jordan's book, she talked a lot about putting the shutters down every time Chelsea's kicked out of the football ground, because there would be a flipping riot going on.
Well, it was, if you didn't have to do much in those days to get battered, and John Pearce of Granny Takes a Trip, he told me they wanted their shop to look intimidating. 10 years later, this is what McLaren and Westwood did, where you couldn't even see in. Yeah. This is a hip boutique, you've got to be very brave to go through it. And they had, in 1966, they painted their window with a face. It was a sort of cartoon face of Mae West. And he told me everything was opaque. The only bit you could see through was the lips. And he said it looked beautiful. And one of the people who helped paint it was Steve Peregrine Took, who's the Boland's partner in Tyrannosaurus Rex, his late 60s group. And that window lasted about 6 months and was then kicked in by the away supporters who'd been at that Saturday's Chelsea match. So then they got it's quite a well-known thing. In fact, it's on the back cover, which you probably can't see at all, but this is half of a 1947 Dodge automobile sticking out into the street in King's Road. And so I said to John, where did you get half of a 1947 Dodge motor car? And he said, Well, actually, I had all of the 1947 Dodge motor car, and it was very old, and it just died on me in Notting Hill one day. So we thought we'll saw it in half.
As you do.
Local council absolutely hated it, but you could get away with that sort of thing then. There were bits of Chelsea. It was actually an era of extreme poverty, a lot of it, in the 19th century. Charles Dickens, who got married at the church just north of the town hall there, so maybe 1 minute's walk from the King's Road, he noted how bad the poverty was in most of Chelsea. And that really was the case. There was still rough areas until about 1980.
Yeah, very slummy when the Rolling Stones were living there, wasn't it?
In Edith Grove, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, describe how disgusting, I mean, and also even before that, when you've got people like George Melly living on Cheney Walk, which is Trillionaire's Row now, but he was...
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Cheney Walk, right by the Albert Bridge, that's where Rossetti and Swinburne were sharing a house. And Swinburne and the painter Simeon Solomon, and they were chasing each other naked around the garden. The neighbours didn't approve of that, but they also didn't approve. Rossetti had a menagerie. He had. There's a list in my book of what he had in his back garden. He had marmots, a wombat. He had this guy who went round the house. He said, "I believe he once kept a gorilla." He was quite a strange man, but he had pheasants, and pheasants shriek like crazy. So you've got people like that, but years later, that's 2 or 3 doors down from that, that's where Keith Richard and Anita Pallenberg were living at the time. She was filming Performance with Mick Jagger, and their bed was the one that was wound up used in for the love scenes between her and Mick Jagger. Mick Jagger's still got a house on Cheney Walk. I don't know if Keith still owns his house, but Isambard Kingdom Brunel was living there. The party scene in Blow Up was shot in a house on Cheney Walk right by the river. And we shared a publisher, Serpent's Tail, a few years ago, and our friend Pete, who started the company, Pete was a 60s guy, he's about 80, 81 these days. Yeah. And he just comes out with his stories just occasionally. And I was talking to him about this party in Blow. I said, "You're on the party scene in Blow." And he just went, "Yeah, I was in it." Because basically Antonioni didn't really, he was looking for Swinging London and it didn't exist. He'd read the papers basically and trying desperately to find it. And they shot this party scene over 2 or 3 days, and he just basically had rounded up loads of young people from the underground magazines like International Times and ours, came in with bags of really strong dope and just chucked them on the beds and said, "Right, you lot, get on with it." And they just filmed the stuff for 2 or 3 days. So yeah, Pete's in Blow Up.
Yeah, no, all the
and many other things. So yeah, there's so many. David Bowie was living there in the early 70s when he did Aladdin Sane. Bolan was living there. It just goes on. Whereas my book finishes in 1979 because somebody else was living there in the midst of all this in the 70s in Flood Street. Now Flood Street is just south. You turn off the King's Road down Flood Street. First thing you go past is Chelsea Manor Studios. And if you've been stood there in 1967, you see a taxi come up. All 4 of the Beatles get out, and Peter Blake and his wife Jan, and they go into Chelsea Manor Studios, and they stand in front of these cardboard blow-ups of hundreds of people's faces, and with a load of florist stuff in front. That's the cover of Sgt. Pepper. It was shot right there in Flood Street on Chelsea Manor Studios. But if you'd have been there in the 70s, you'd see a few doors down, private house, and a couple of policemen standing there all the time, because the leader of the opposition lived there. 1979, she won the election. She moved to Downing Street. To me, that is the big black clouds coming down, and that's after that, and the era that she ushered in, the loads of money, the whole massive unemployment. I was living just south of the river in Battersea at that time, and I was in the Dole. And by that stage, Chelsea really, by the 80s and since, it's if you want to start up in business, you couldn't do it the way McLaren and Westwood had done it, or indeed Mary Quant, who I interviewed for the book. She started in a bedsit in Oakley Street off
No,
the King's
that's
Road.
really interesting
Yeah.
that you probably have got the last in-depth interview with Mary Quant in your book.
The thing is, I did the original edition of this in 2005, and then I greatly expanded it last year. This book sort of doubled in size. There's new interviews in this, but Mary I spoke to in 2005, and she didn't need to talk to me. She was hugely wealthy, particularly she just sold her cosmetics business to the Japanese for hundreds of millions of pounds. And it took me 6 months just to get anywhere near being able to talk to her. And she was lovely, she was fantastic. And she'd never heard of me, so God bless her, she really gave me some lovely information about how everything connected. She was friends with the Royal Court actors. She used to go on holiday, her and her husband would go on holiday with John Osborne and his wife Mary Ure in the play. And they would all eat at the same restaurants, and so on. It just all connects. Chelsea was a very small world, and they did. Ken Adam, who was designing all the great James Bond sets, and indeed the Dr. Strangelove, the war room there, Ken Adam would sit there in this restaurant called Alvaro's with his friend Len Dayton, who was writing the Crest File and Funeral in Berlin. And in the corner, you've got the Rolling Stones, who had an account there, and you've got Mary Quant. I asked Mary, she said, yeah, we used to go there all the time. And that room, Alvaro's, it's now a stationer's, and it's half the size of the room. So it was a very small world, but really firing, and a lot of working class people.
Yeah.
Len Dayton is a good example. Michael Caine, who was living there, Terence Stamp. That so many possibilities, and I lost interest by the end of the 70s because I thought I'm not interested in somewhere where it is just the super rich basically having to. I didn't want to trace the rise of. Well, by 10 years ago, there were 4 different branches of Starbucks in that shop.
But can you remember the first time you ever set foot on the King's Road, Mike?
That would be in the punk days. It would be 76 or 77. I'm from Portsmouth, so that was a journey up. And that was big things. I came up to see the Ramones in 77 at the Rainbow, which was staggering. And you would visit these hallowed places that you've been reading about as a provincial, having listened to John Peel, read The Enemy every week. I interviewed John Peel for the original edition of the book, and he was fantastic because John cuts all the way through this. John was a rock and roll fan back in the 50s, and then he became a very important DJ in the mid-60s, and he would talk to me about, the hippie fashions, when it all changed, sort of 67, suddenly really smelly Afghan coats came, and people wearing, I used to know a guy who ran the Whiskey A Go-Go in the 60s, and another club called the Bag of Nails, and he put on the first Otis Redding gigs in this country, stuff like that. And he told me he actually had to put up a sign outside the nightclub saying, no bells, because the noise of everybody clanking was driving him mad, basically. And I mentioned that to John, and he just said, yeah, I had a bell once. I felt compelled to, but I wore it once and then I left it in the cupboard. He was brilliant, and then obviously he's so important. He was good friends with Mark Bolan, and then he was playing, the important punk things. But I would come on pilgrimages, and other people that I talked to, punk people like Reckless Eric, T.B. Smith from the Adverts I interviewed, most of us were from the provinces, and so the journey up to London to visit the bright lights, and then you get there and you find this road is, you can walk down it in 20 minutes. As I always compare it with Broadway, because that's a famous street, 8 miles long, it takes all day to walk Broadway. So yeah, the layers and layers and layers, which then, given that I'm finishing in 79, and really you're starting,
in 79.
And your 2 key figures, your sort of parallel opposites, is Susie Sue and Thatcher. Because there's a decade of Goth. I'm going back to, I start with Henry VIII and Thomas More, who were some of the only people living owning property in Chelsea in the old days. You are tracing those 2 through, and it's just the situation in the country, and from those 2 perspectives that the people reacting against. Now, you start with your own personal story, because you were growing up at that time and being affected directly by the Goth movement.
Well, yeah, I was just a little girl at 11 years old when Margaret Thatcher came into power, and my parents hated her and would scream at the TV every time she appeared. And my mother would say, that woman, she's a disgrace, she's a traitor to her class, to her sex, to her country. And I, fumbling around for enlightenment, wondering why my parents hated her so much. They had a very extensive library, my parents, they were both teachers, and they had all these very worthy books, but they also had this pile of pulp paperbacks with these sulphurous yellow spines. And one of them was called The Satanist. And I was like, why do my parents have a book? And one of them was called To the Devil a Daughter. And the one called To the Devil a Daughter, I inched it off the shelf one day and ran up to my bedroom and dared to bring it across the threshold and read it under my duvet, well, continental quilt as they were called in those days, by torchlight. And in the beginning of this book was this definition of what a Satanist is, and I'm going to read it for you because it's so lovely. In the old days, the devil was often referred as the lord of misrule. The object of these high-up Satanists is to deliver the world to him, and the only way they can do this is to cause the breakdown of good rule so that misrule may take its place. With that as their goal, they do everything they can to foment wars, class hatred, strikes and famine, and to foster perversions, moral laxity and the taking of drugs. Gosh, so, of course, I genuinely, that's turning into her voice, is it?
Yeah.
I thought, that's what she's doing. Satan is alive, because Dennis Wheatley warns in the beginning of all these books that Satanism is very much alive and well in London, if you go to the right places. And I assumed that place was number 10 Downing Street. But as Max had alluded, in this place at the end of the King's Road, number 430, where Malcolm and Vivian had disrupted the music world so patently, there was another quote that I found really amazing, and it was Peter York, and he was talking about a man called Alfred Sherman. And he said, this man made a career out of thinking the unthinkable and then inflicting his views on the first person he saw and trying to get them to spread. And I thought he could be talking about Malcolm McLaren, but in fact he was talking about Margaret Thatcher's guru, the man who basically put her into power. So I thought it was such an interesting time, wasn't it? The end of the 70s, the winter of discontent.
It felt like everything switched. I mean, in music, but in fashion, but also it just a lot of things you take for granted. Suddenly, it's like, oh, right, it's a new decade, and it was very strange, very strange. I know the 70s were very different from the 60s. I lived through both decades, but I felt like complete. Having been a sort of teenage punk and into rockabilly and lots of sort of, I felt completely out of water in the 80s with what was going on, a lot of it. And some of the people that you write about so well in your book were making some of the only music that I actually liked, which I saw the birthday party supported by Leinsters and Noy Barton in '83. And people like that. You just think, thank God somebody actually is still interested in loud, nasty noises and not everything on a synthesizer pre-programmed and produced by Trevor Horn and sounding so squeaky clean. I didn't, I'd seen The Clash, I didn't need to see this, whatever. So some of those people were definitely making something that just felt had more guts to it.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting that as Alfred Sherman and Margaret Thatcher disrupted the political norm, because it is, when I started writing this book, I did try to, just for a while, to stop hating her and just think, but how did she achieve what she did? Because she's basically a working class woman from Grantham. Her dad was a shopkeeper called Alf Roberts, almost the same as Coronation Street. How on earth did she get past all those entitled blokes that had been to Eton, especially as we've had so many of them, to do what she did? And it was this coalition with Sherman. He was very much a McLaren character. He came from a Jewish background, and he felt he'd actually been an ardent communist, and he'd gone to Spain and fought in Spain against the fascists, and then he'd served during World War II, and then he'd come back and he'd totally disrupted the system the way. But he, like Malcolm, he needed this shopkeeper's daughter from the provinces to make his ideals sellable. So that was my starting point. And Susie is like the anti-Margaret Thatcher. She comes because of Malcolm McLaren, because he gave her that opportunity with the Punk Festival in 1976. But it's also quite interesting how very different the first four bands that I write about, the Banshees, The Cure, Magazine and Joy Division, they're all initiated by punk, by the Pistols, yeah.
Some of the bands that these days get labelled goth, I saw them at the time. I was going to see a punk band as far as I was concerned. I saw The Cure in 1979 when I was buying their records. And the word goth didn't exist, and they were incredibly powerful. And there was a couple of hundred people there, but they were just stunning. And I think the good people who came out of punk were very individual in their own way. You wouldn't mistake Wire for the Buzzcocks, for instance, and you wouldn't mistake either of those for The Cure. It's, the good people, I think, X-Ray Specs, you knew you'd seen them. They were like nothing else, basically. There wasn't an identical formula that
it was very good for women.
Yeah.
And it was also very good for gay people. Because another thing about, being out in the provinces, I mean, people like Susie and Ian Curtis from Joy Division, they were in big cities. They were in London and Manchester, and they could get into these gay clubs where they had the Roxy nights and the Berry nights, and where it was safe for people who went, beer boys to dress up. But out in the provinces, there weren't any gay clubs where I grew up in Yarmouth, and quite a lot of my friends were secretly but daring to come out. But I thought it was the moment that Jordan, who obviously worked in the shop with Malcolm and Vivian, and when I did her book, and she talked a lot about how important it was when they saw David Bowie on top of the pops with Mick Ronson. And for me, it was seeing Soft Cell and Mark Almond being somebody that your mother definitely wouldn't want to bring home. And I thought they really stood out in that, as she was saying, that time of the futurists, as they were called, or new romantics, who were all sort of looking forward to this sort of bright future. And, Depeche Mode from Basildon, from this new town, singing about new life, and quite optimistic and pop-tastic, but Soft Cell looking back over their shoulder to Northern Soul, and and to his favourite. He talked a lot about having a picture of Diana Dawes over his bed and Joan Mansfield. They were his guardian angels.
And of course, where did Diana Dawes live in the 40s and 50s? She lived in Chelsea.
Yes, you've got
having wild parties with a two-way mirror on the ceiling that they didn't tell their guests about. So that was part of the entertainment. You sneak upstairs and watch people doing all sorts of emotional things to each other through this two-way mirror. That was Chelsea in 1950.
Yes, the thing that always sticks in my mind about that is that our mutual friend Damon and his revelation about, he wrote Diana Dawes' biography, and how Bob Monkhurst was almost killed for a dalliance with Di. Yes.
Well, Mark Almond was, I think, a very important strand in your book, because he is looking across to Jack Brel and that sort of tradition. You mentioned the Northern Soul, which Dave Ball, the other half of Soft Cell, was a huge enthusiast for, and they seemed very, very knowing, but they liked a bit of grit in it. They liked a bit of dirt, whereas I think the sort of shiny end of the 80s, which repelled me in terms of music, there was no dirt there. It was just shallow, and let's get ourselves on top of the pops, and that's it. It's the sort of almost, or the ultimate expression of Bros, when will I be famous? I mean, that these days is a very popular sentiment. You just want to be famous for doing nothing and get your picture on it. I didn't grow up respecting that sort of thing. It's like if you saw, I used to see Mark Almond in the street because I was working in Wardour Street in the mid-80s, and he was living in Soho. So I'd go out at lunch and I'd see him just wandering around. And he was just an interesting guy. You could admire lots of the stuff.
Again, another sort of ley line, St Anne's Court was where some bizarre his record company was, and that's where the reason that Steve-O wanted to set up there was because Tony Visconti had recorded T-Rex there.
Trident Studios, absolutely.
Yeah.
I was working, my building was 142 Wardour Street, the edge of it is St Anne's Court, so part of our building was the old Trident Studio.
So and then you would be on the direct ley line to get to the Batcave from there, which obviously you did
I used to, right the early days I went to the Batcave, and you would see a strange bunch of people there. It was just the year it opened, and for me, I wanted to go out dancing somewhere where I could still hear Iggy Pop, T-Rex, Bowie, because a lot of people just weren't playing that anymore. The Batcave was.
And at the same time, you would be able to hear the Cramps and Killing Jane.
But you would see. I remember seeing. I was in the queue once, and there's a guy in front of me with and you didn't see really extreme haircuts in those days. You saw punky haircuts. But this guy's got the full Tibetan thing where you've just got the little tiny ponytail at the back and everything else shaved, head to foot leather gear, and a massive silver, it was probably stainless steel, skull hanging from his belt. I was on a psychic TV, just standing queuing to get in. But you get inside and there's Jimmy Percy from Sham 69 staggering about. And then Mark Allman got up and did a little impromptu with the keyboard. Did some Lou Reed stuff and whatever. It was quite a few different scenes meeting.
Well, it was interesting. There's a goth supergroup that convened at the Batcave, which was called the Immaculate Consumptive, and it was Lydia Lunch, Nick Cave, Jim Thirlwell, and Mark Almond. And these people have come from all over the world, from Australia, from Berlin, from New York, and they meet down a club in London. And this is a really interesting thing about the season of the witch. I was telling somebody earlier, it took me a year to plan out how to write this book, because there's so many different bands involved in it, coming from all over the world, but they all meet in these places and they all become friends with each other and they all inspire each other. And they all go off and are in each other's bands and in each other's beds, but they're, So like the fact that the King's Road, a few people could be in one place and the ideas could spread out.
Sure.
Yeah.
And because what you do, you're also you're looking back to people who have a sensibility that could be allied to.
Yeah.
What for instance, Dave Vanian from The Damned, for instance, he's a very erudite guy, and he knows his Hammer horror films, obviously, but he also knows a lot of other things going forward about. And so you're tracing back to people like Aubrey Beardsley, people like Billie Holiday, and so on, and people who have a certain strand. Obviously, Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein, and just how does it all? Because nobody comes out completely blankly out of nowhere.
No, it's true, and the more I thought about it, the more when people have asked me questions at gigs and stuff, that I think that the Gothic is probably part of our DNA. I think that the Goths in the 80s, it goes on to be quite, because one thing that I think is a misconception about Goth is that it was a totally apolitical and quite sort of vacuous tra-la-la, and it was actually very politically engaged, and people like New Model Army running through lines of police to get food to striking miners, and as the 80s became uglier, and a lot of people in the bands that were in the Batcave ended up at the Battle of the Beanfield in Stonehenge in 1985, which it shouldn't really be called a battle. It was 2,000 police against 600 hippies. It's not really a battle, is it? But anyway, so the 80s, but what I thought, it's when William Blake wrote Jerusalem, he was writing about the start of the Industrial Revolution. And then when Justin Sullivan wrote the song 1984, which was about the miners' strike rather than George Orwell's 1984, and he quoted Jerusalem in this green and pleasant land in 1984. He's talking about that's the end of the Industrial Revolution, the end. So I think that the goths that I talk about in the 80s, whether it's Lydia talking about the America under Reagan, whether it's the Cramps and the Gun Club bringing those sort of hellbound spirits of rockabilly and blues, or whether it's New Model Army being more directly political, or the Banshees doing a sort of scary cinema soundtrack to the 80s, and Joy Division, as I think those two bands really are very cinematic.
One of the things that I was going to ask you is, because a lot of the bands that you talk about, if you were to ask them, do you consider yourself a goth band? They would say, no, we don't.
Apart from Lydia, she'd go, yeah, and...
Because I think, famously, if I think of goth bands, I think, Bauhaus, phenomenally good band. But I believe, I don't think that they don't like being called a goth band.
No, none of them like to say, one of my missions is to try and make goth not a dirty word. Because I think this music has been mocked by its destructors, and like I say, being, it's the softy of youth cultures. They all like flowers and, wandering around graveyards trying to be Lord Byron. And there was actually a lot more to it, and because I guess it sort of mirrors me being a little girl growing into an adolescent. This was my soundtrack. It was really powerful to me, and I was learning stuff through these bands and through reading the music press that I wasn't getting anywhere else, and from fanzines and
There's because for me it was earlier than that. It was I was growing up with Bowie and T-Rex and Mott the Hoople and then the Ramones, Patti Smith, the Sex Pistols, and there's a quote that I use in my King's Road book, and it's actually a radio interview with Iggy Pop from 1977 when he was touring with David Bowie playing keyboards for him, and he's talking about where you get the important information as a teenager. And he said there was a time at the beginning of the 60s, or it was 63, 64, you could watch a Rolling Stones concert, and he's talking about 63, 64, early Rolling Stones. He said you could learn something about how to talk, how to dance, how to dress, and how to act generally. All these things about very, very important information if you're sort of 14 years old. And, he said kids these days, they don't need that anymore. He's talking in 1977. He said they already know these things. I don't know if that was true. I certainly didn't feel that way. But you do this. The people that are important to you that you see on television or on a record sleeve or something at a crucial time in your life, which is why that impulse to dress up, to say, look, I'm different, I'm not the same as the straight people in my village or my town or whatever. And that's been going on. Right, my next book, I'm trying to desperately plug something, it comes out in January, but it's a history of teddy boys, just in the 1950s, and just because they were the first people. After them come the beatniks, and then the mods, and then the sort of mid-60s groovy people, and then the hippies, and then the skinheads, and then glam rock people, and the heavy metal people, and the punks, and on and on.
But
the impulse of working class kids without much money or anything, but just saying, I'm going to walk down the street like an exhibition, and society can just deal with it, and I don't. And I'm going to risk being beaten up when I walk out my front door. My parents are going to hate it, but I don't care. There isn't a book that examines why did they start doing that? Where did they come from? What were their names? What were their telephones?
It's so amazing, isn't it, that they appear at the time of bomb sites and rationing.
Totally, yeah. Most original Teds were born during the Blitz, sort of 1940, 41. The original ones in 1953 were still at school. They were 13, 14 years old. You left school at 15. You then got a job, quite a well-paid job, because if you have a world war that kills off most of the available men to the factory fodder, basically, then you have full employment, which the employers absolutely hated, because kids of that age at that time, someone said to me, if you didn't like your job, you could walk out of it on a Friday afternoon knowing you could walk into another one on Monday morning. So they had a wage packet at the age of 15, and they would go to their local tailor in the East End or in South London and say, right, I want a fingertip length draped jacket, I want a velvet collar, I want the pockets to be like this, I want these shoes, I want the trousers 19-inch bottoms or narrow. The previous generation, their parents' generation, hated them because their parents had the depression, and just, you couldn't do that. And so suddenly you've got your kids who can actually not just be a small adult and dressed exactly like their parents, but that whole thing of, it was post-war relative prosperity that's kicked off youth cultures, or the ability to, and you could buy records, and then along comes rock and roll. So you've got something to identify with.
But yeah, how the Teds subverted it as well. That style was supposed to be for toffs to wear, wasn't it? That the drinks.
Yes, totally. Yeah, basically just after the war, cloth was rationed over here. It wasn't rationed in France. We got our fashions from France, particularly women's fashions, and so you've got Christian Dior and various other people. The new look, as I call it, a new look inside Granny's wardrobe. It's basically Edwardian fashions. Huge amounts of cloth, massive amounts of cloth, bustles, literally, and sort of fur muffs to. After wartime austerity, suddenly Fleet Street and all the fashion houses were saying, "Women, you're going to need to dress like this," and cloth was rationed. You just couldn't. But it did catch on, and so almost every wedding of any kind, whether poor or rich, the bride was dressed in an Edwardian style dress, and the bridesmaids were also wearing and had Edwardian hairstyles, and so by the end of the 40s, Savile Row caught on to that and said, well, okay, if the women are buying this, let's try and sell it to the men. And they meant the rich, they meant literally Prince Philip, they were trying to sell it to, and the wealthy, people who had their own tailor in Savile Row. And they got a couple of years' worth out of it, and then these working class oiks started imitating it, and Savile Row dropped it like a stone. But that's why they called Teddy Boys Edwardian Ted.
And that's what Malcolm McLaren brought back to the
He did, yeah. His first shop at 430 Kings Road was he was selling Teddy Boy fashions to in a sea of hippie fashions. There he was. That was a radical statement. And bands started showing up. If you remember Top of the Pops, you've got people like Roy Wood's Wizard, you've got Mud, people like that. It wasn't unusual to see draped jackets and creepers. I'm not talking about Shiwaddy Waddy, who came up via a talent show a few years later, but some seriously hip people. The Move were wearing basically variations on Ted gear in 1969, and so it was in the air, and McLaren got hold of that. And there's pictures of Johnny Rotten in '77 photographed for a German magazine inside 430 Kings Road, wearing a Teddy Boy jacket and with his hair slicked back. That could get you seriously beaten up. And I saw Wayne County's Electric Chairs in 1977 in Portsmouth, when their new single was called Fuck Off. And somebody in the audience had come to the show wearing a Teddy Boy dress. This is a very dangerous thing to do in Portsmouth as a punk, walk through. Portsmouth's a very heavy Ted stronghold, always has. And halfway through the gig, they threw the jacket on stage, and Wayne County wore it for the rest of the gig. And a few months later, he put out a song called Eddie and Sheena, which was a star-crossed song about a Teddy Boy and a punk, and their romance and how it all went wrong. So yeah, but to me, I was buying rock and roll records and I was buying punk records. I should have been beating the hell out of myself in '77.
No, but this is the thing. I always think that I've got one pointy foot in the rock and roll rockabilly thing, and one pointy feet in goth. And I think the Cramps are the big crossover band in all of that, aren't they?
To them, it was all good music. Some of the stuff that they covered was sort of '60s garage band stuff. Like Green Fuzz, by the Green Fuzz, but they're doing pure obscure rockabilly from the '50s. Sunglasses After Dark by Dwight Pull and Rock on the Moon by Jimmy Stewart. But then they're also writing things which are a mutation of that.
Yeah, and
I mean,
you can't tell
no,
where
you
their
really
original
can't.
composition started.
You hear Garbage Band and you just think, well, where did that come from?
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, and so there they are at the back end. I mean, they regret the fact that they're a CBGB band. You know, they're playing alongside the Ramones and Blondie and Television at CBGB in 76, 77.
They're mooning to Edwin that
Yeah,
they
and
never
nobody ever says it.
No one ever said they were there when they left.
Yeah.
They were too weird for America.
Yeah, and, well, they were, which is why they came over here. And the label that was putting their records out in the 80s was, Big Big, which is Ace Records, which was started by Ted Carroll. And if you went to Malcolm McLaren's shop, 1971, Ted Carroll was he was the guy decorating the whole 50s thing for them. He was supplying Billy Fury posters and rare 50s vinyl. I interviewed Ted from the King's Road book. He's old enough. He saw the Bill Haley tour in '57 when it got Dublin. And the first thing he said to me was, of course, my real name's David. I've been called Ted since 1956 because I went to school with narrow trousers and a hairslip because I was a Teddy boy. And he came over to Britain. He's been in Britain since the early 70s. He came over. He was managing Thin Lizzy. He came over when they first started. They've been here ever since. And wonderful guy. His career in rock and roll was incredible.
One of the funniest things because I got to interview Vivienne Westwood with Jordan for her book, and she said that Malcolm was too scared to go into the Ted pubs. He would push her through the door because she was an original Teddy girl, and I think that always was her favourite sort of music.
Yeah.
She always kept that look to the end, didn't she?
Yeah.
But big hard Malcolm that goes to this Ted's pub in Tottenham. In you go. I'll just wait out here.
They're very, very intimidating places to go to.
And when I interviewed Roger Sargent, he's Ted's partner in Ace Records and Big Beat and all that, and my favourite quote from him in here is when he said that they were going round, can they go in these pubs and sell their records? Sunglasses Ron gives them a nod and they're good to go. Anyway, you might have wandered far away from the parameters.
I'm wondering how we're doing for...
How are we doing for time?
It's 25 to 9.
25 to 9, we're doing not bad. So, because we will, in about 5 or 10 minutes, if we go through to questions, but just, because there's crossover coming through, because I'm talking about, if you think rock and roll and all of these bands, I mean, I once saw The Cure, having seen them in front of a couple of hundred people in London in 1979. The next time I saw them, I was staying in Paris in about 1986, 87. They did this thing it's like a weekend thing in France called the Fête de la Musique, and basically there's bands playing everywhere for free. And The Cure were playing for free as part of that in the Place de la République, so it's like Trafalgar Square but much bigger, and it was free, and I went along. Me and I think 40,000 other people went along. And they're huge, they're absolutely, and the idea that bands from this country could go out around the world, and that did not exist. The first person who ever had a #1 hit in the American charts from this country was Vera Lynn. In, I think, 1952, with a throwback thing. It sounds like a wartime song, Auf Wiedersehen, Sweetheart, with a service choir singing. I don't know why that was a #1 in America, but it was. But the idea that this country could do rock music, that was something we got from America. But then suddenly you have Lolly Donegan managed to get in the American charts 2 or 3 weeks before Elvis's Heartbreak Hotel went up the American charts. And that was revolutionary. And there's a band in the skiffle days, which is 56, 57, that started out in a coffee bar, because if you were a skiffle band you had to play in a coffee bar, and these places tiny, but it's where you'd find the young people, because they couldn't drink, they weren't old enough to drink usually in pubs, so coffee bars were good. And there was one on the King's Road called The Fantasy. It was run by Mary Quant's business partner, Archie McNair. And they were called the Chas McDavid Skiffle Group. So in 1956, they are playing to 3 or 4 interested people in a coffee bar on the King's Road. 1957, they're on the Ed Sullivan Show. They're in the American charts on that show alongside the Everly Brothers with a song called Freight Train. This is 6 years before the Beatles got over there selling American sort of rock music back to them. Revolutionary. And of course, as I point out in this, it's like if you look at the 60s revolution, that is the 50s, it all starts in the 50s. The Beatles were all teddy boys. You know, the 50s was the era in which Keith Richards first picked up a guitar, McCartney, Lennon, the Buddy Holly tour was incredibly important in '58 because it's 2 guitars, a bass, drums, and write your own songs. That's the blueprint. That's what the Beatles followed. That's how to do it. Don't take things from songwriters. And it's the year that David Bailey first started taking photographs. It's the decade, the 50s. It's the decade when Mary Quant first started doing clothes. So many things that then exploded in the 60s. The 50s came along, but I think the idea that if you think the Rolling Stones, they're still going, but they came out of this country taking very American forms of music and just around the world, massive. I think the biggest live audience that anyone's ever played to is the Stones on the beach in Rio. I think they got 1.5 million people to a free concert at some stage in the 80s. That's insane. I mean, I played the Reading Festival, and that's you literally can't see into the distance. It's just people. But that I think would have been 40, 50,000 people I was looking at.
Yeah.
Nobody come there to see us, but I know what it looks like. But 1.5 million.
And the Cure, 30.
Yeah, the Cure have done some, particularly in South America. Some of these bands, and you just think it was astonishing. People didn't look to this country for that kind of stuff. And also the fashions. You find, as you travel around the world, the rock and roll clothing fashions and styles. I mean, the goth look really.
I think Robert, I nearly said Robert Plant. Robert Smith's look in particular.
Yeah.
I think there must be a little bob in every village across the globe because it's quite an easy look to pull.
Yeah.
I mean, I used to spend hours. I had a little picture or cut out of smash head by my mirror, that comb in my hair to look like him, because I never thought I could look as good as Susie, but I thought Robert Smith, it was achievable. And there are little Robert Smiths everywhere around the world. Who would have thought a band from Creepy Crawley could go?
Well, that's the thing. It did. The styles, the impulse to dress up, you do see as you travel around lots of different countries. You think, okay, they're imitating this British youth look from that year, that it's really spread. It's really quite astonishing how it has. And there was in Tokyo in the 90s, there's a magazine. I think it's still going, but Doll magazine. There used to be adverts in the back of it for a shop in Tokyo, and they would show you a photograph of here's Sid Vicious, head to foot, part of it Westwood McLaren gear, part of it stuff he'd just done, and they could sell you a replica of every last thing he was wearing, including the particular paddle that he had around his neck. And very, very expensive, but beautifully, absolutely obsessive. And I used to work in a place called the Vintage Magazine Shop in Soho, where we just had piles of every kind of magazine and newspaper, including all the music press. And this is 30 years ago, and we get Japanese teenagers coming in, and they pull out a wad of £20 notes. Insane. I guess the ones that could afford to travel over here.
Yeah.
But they would all be asking, do we have an Enemy or Sense? They wanted one with Sid Vicious on the cover. And you tried to tell them, actually, he couldn't even play. The original lineup didn't even, it's Glenn playing the but no, they wanted an image of Sid Vicious. And
that's it. Yeah.
It's totally the book.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because Vivian wanted him. She thought he was the John that should be the singer. And you know, he would have been rubbish, wouldn't he? But the look that he had,
Yeah.
she's looking through fashion eyes. She saw the look that would endure.
Yeah. And in Japan, it really worked.
Nick Cave started off looking like Sid Vicious, I think, with the hair and just a slightly more exaggerated version, but that must have been his template to begin with.
Do you think maybe we should
yes.
see if anyone wants to ask anything? The sound of tumbleweed blowing.
I've got one to start. The half a car
Yes.
out of on King's Road.
Yeah.
Is that what started Camden with all their shops, with all the big things sticking out of the wall?
I think the big thing sticking out of the wall, that would have been an influence, but whether they know that, that is really, as Camden was going wrong, that stuff started to proliferate, and I think the first shop that did that in the mid-90s was one of the shoe shops, and they had a giant
Doc
plasticky Doc Martens, yeah, that's right. Whereas if you went to Camden Market in the 80s, I don't remember seeing anything like that up and down there. And in fact, the song that I played called Don't Need the Sunshine, which is obviously about the demise of Camden, I'm quoting actually the old manager of the Pogues, a guy called Frank Murray, who was disgusted with what had happened to Camden, and he said, pardon my French, he said, how many fucking shoe shops do they need down there these days? You might as well rename Camden High Street Imelda Marcos Boulevard, which is why I use that phrase in there. So that is something that was a 90s phenomenon, but yeah, somebody might well, the person who put the shoes up there might well have seen that, because that 3D thing is very, very powerful.
Yeah.
But there was a record shop actually on the corner of Buck Street off Camden High Street 30 years ago, and it had a motorbike crashed through the window, and it was like encased in perspex, so the whole motorbike, one half of it was sticking into the shop and the other half was good record shop.
I'd like to ask crossovers into literature from music in both goth and punk. That do you cover those in the books?
Yes,
or?
very much.
Yeah.
So,
I wanted them to actually be in each chapter, but it's ended up being in the back of the book as an appendix of the section called Building a Gothic Library on books that I think, you know, any self-respecting goth should have. And also midnight movies, because I think it was a genre really informed by the cinema as well. So, and in that tradition of, you know, the American midnight movies, which were very Crampsian, weren't they, when they had sort of freak show screenings and people like Bela Lugosi introducing. So I've got, and it's not just the books that I think people are influenced by, but also books and films that kind of, I hope, give you the context of what it was like at the time. So for instance, in my Killing Joke chapter, I say if you watched Horace Ove's film Pressure, you would see what Ladbroke Grove was like when Killing Joke started up, when they were in squats in that area, which might, you know, if you hadn't seen that and you'd grown up around the Notting Hill of the Richard Curtis years, you might find it, how on earth did Killing Joke start life in a squat in what is now the richest road in all of the world, and where they started off. So yeah, I've put a lot of books in here, and I've done a lot of little short things about authors that I think are important. Some of them in each chapter's got, so each chapter moves to the 80s, but it's got a goth mother and a goth father, and then it also has at the back films, books, and I've tried to profile people who I think are important, from the Bronte sisters and obviously the Shelleys, and up to people like James Elroy and Derek Raymond.
And with the King's Road, there are so many writers who lived there. As I said, Charles Dickens got married there. I mentioned Poe being there, but then you get into the 20th century, and very, very important literary salon there was the Sitwells, Edith Sitwell and her brothers living on the King's Road, and everybody passed through there. you look at their guest list, their dinner parties in the 30s and the late 20s, it is all the Bloomsbury people. It's plus a selection of writers now, people like Picasso coming to dinner with. So, but it was a literary salon. It was a very important one. And then, of course, as I say, Ian Fleming writing. But by the 50s, suddenly all of these strange youth movements that were coming up, and I mentioned coffee bars. Coffee bars was such a thing. A lot of novelists started including them in, there's usually a scene in a late 50s novel where they go to Chelsea and there's these young people sitting on chairs that are deliberately designed to be as uncomfortable as possible, where somebody calling himself Manuel comes around and does something very bad on a guitar, but he's actually, Bert from the East End. And so it became a place to locate things. It stood for Bohemia, and to bring it into the 60s, 1966, and I have a copy of this book, and you probably wouldn't want one. It's a novel called The Leftovers, and it's a sort of future that some strange science fiction thing has happened that has killed everybody except these few people who are on a tube train, and they come out and they move into the Dorchester, then they move into Apsley House, the Duke of Wellington's place, and they go running off down the King's Road and whatever. And it's a bunch of young people running wild. It's really, really, really not a good book. And it was written by, apologies, but it was written by somebody who these days is very, very well known, but has never written another novel. But it was a 19-year-old called Polly Toynbee. But they go down the King's Road, they go to Chelsea because of its boat, to look for what was left of it, and of course there's nothing left of it. So yeah, I mentioned Germaine Greer writing the female unit there. And in fact, in the 18th century, late 17th century, just near the Chelsea Physic Garden, a woman called Mary Astle wrote one of the early feminist texts about the rights of women living in Chelsea, when Chelsea was a village of 100 people. So, there's always been literature there, and I do trace that through.
What about the natural successors to Goth and punk? Because you seem to have a cut-off point.
Yeah, we both had a cut-off point. I think I didn't really want to write about Goth after 1990, because I think the bands started becoming very derivative. The ones that were the sort of what people saw in their minds as Goth. I think what actually was Goth went elsewhere, and some of it went into industrial music. I think Jim Fetus is probably a really good example of that. He came over here from Australia. He came to London from Australia. He was in millions of different bands and making millions of records. And then he went back to America with Lydia Lunch, who was then his partner, in 1983. And he said to me that he thought it was totally dead here by then. But he started making music with people like Swans. And so he goes off into industrial and grunge, where I think also, Nirvana obviously heard Killing Joke, and Come As You Are is 80s by Killing Joke, and the Gun Club really influenced Mark Lanigan and the Screaming Trees, and so did Simon Bonney and Crime and the Six Solution. So where I think the stuff that I really like is there is, I think, a crossroads of Goth, where, as I mentioned Soft Cell earlier, and their antecedent Suicide, the electronic bit, and part of it goes that way, and I think Suicide and Soft Cell incorporate the other bit, which is the twang. So it's either the guitar or the synthesizer. So I think, I can see the guitar bit went off into grunge, and you could write another book about how that happened and where that went next. And the dance bit went off into bands like Coil and Psychic TV and all that more dance stuff, which is stuff that I'm not all that au fait with myself, and I know there's been other really good books written on that, and I wanted to just write about who I thought were the original people, and not everyone who copied to sort of mercy afterwards, you know, so that was why it had the cut-off point for me.
I think most music scenes don't last very long. You've got the initial burst of activity, which is usually very diverse. As I said, you wouldn't mistake, look at the CBGB bands in New York, you're not going to mistake Blondie for the Ramones, and you're not going to mistake either of those for the Patti Smith group. And yet they're all playing the same shows at the same time, and they're all part of that explosion. And to me, they go into a decadent phase, and then, as you say, it gets into copyists. You know, people, they've bought the uniform and they're trying to sound like somebody else.
Do something different.
Yeah, and it generally, most bands don't last very long, because you've got a statement and you sort of worked it through, and then when you start getting bored with your own music, then that's time to stop. And hopefully there's something new that has come along that is different enough that you wouldn't call it goth or punk or whatever.
But you know, it can look like some really beautiful young goths have come to some of my talks who could be my grandchildren. And they've got their own music that I know nothing about, but they're really, you know, it's exciting for them, and it's also sort of political for them as well, and it's like it was for me. So I think it will just mutate on into different, I think, like I say, I think it's part of our sort of cultural DNA, this gothic thing as a reaction to traumatic times, and you know, it will continue, but yeah, I definitely wanted a cut-off point, and so did you, didn't you?
Yeah. And again, with approaching the Teddy Boy thing, you can find Teds these days if you know where to look. I mean, and a lot of them are younger than me, and they got into it at a certain stage. But if you meet an original Ted, they're in their mid to late 80s. You know? So I dealt with the 50s and what led up to it, why they came along, and I pretty much stopped just as the 60s come along, because suddenly they're more old news. There's new people start combing their hair forward, and they've got, in '62 they've got two new role models. They've got the first James Bond film, and they got the first Beatles single, and that's telegraphing the sort of the way the 60s were going to go. And it was not about what made it exciting to be a Teddy Boy 10 years before that, and what you would be looking up to, where you'd want to go dancing, and indeed what you'd want to dance to as well.
What about the King's Road? How did you choose your cut-off point there?
The fact that it got too expensive, it basically became, most of my favourite things that I thought were interesting, it was usually chances just moving in. I mean, there were hippie squats on the King's Road, and that's the one that Eric Clapton was living in. The place was falling down. It was a 150-year-old building, and it had been a posh building. And it went through so many, it's called the Pheasantry, and these days it's Pizza Express, it's still there. But it was where, if you wanted to buy a pheasant, if you were Dantigate or Rossetti in the mid-19th century, you went down the King's Road to the Pheasantry, and you could buy them. By the First World War, and just after it, it was a ballet school run by an expat, an émigré Russian ballerina, and she would find kids from London and around here, rename them with exotic, hopefully sort of ballet russe kind of names. That's where Margot Fontaine trained, the Alicia Markova, who's from Muswell Hill, you know, and Anton Dolin, you know, and all of these people. So it's a ballet school. By the 50s, the Pheasantry is a posh restaurant, and if you were Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall, that's where they used, visiting town, that's where they used to be. 10 years later, it's falling down, and it's got all these counterculture hippies living in it. And there's a club in the basement, and by 1970 there's loud noise coming up from there because the house band there is awkward in their early things. And in 1972, when Lou Reed's new album was Transformer, massive hit over here, and Walk on the Wild Side is in the charts, his one London gig was playing in the basement of the Pheasantry. And now it's Pizza Express. So you had all of that because it was a falling down building, and you could have. I interviewed Mick Farron for the book, and he said, "Look, I went to the Pheasantry all the time. I was going out with Jermaine Greer for a while, and he said it was horrible. It was a grotty little dump." And in those places, people can move in cheaply and do cultural things, which is why CBGB happened in the East Village, in the Bowery, where you could eat you could live very, very cheaply. It was quite dangerous, but that's where cultural things happen. It does not happen in Knightsbridge when you have to pay £6 million for a one-bedroom flat or whatever it is. And these things get driven out, basically. And that's what always happens. So yeah, King's Road, that's why I stopped in 1980. Thatcher getting in was a useful cut-off point, but really it became a wildly expensive area by even 5 years ago.
Yeah, although my first trip, I can remember the first time I went to King's Road when I first was 18 and I was a student. I just got into London College of Fashion and I went straight to King's Road to go to the Great Gear Market to buy tickets to see Nick Cave.
The Great Gear Market was, they demolished it in the 80s and built a Sainsbury's, I think, or Waitrose.
Your future dream is a shopping
Exactly.
street.
But it was, Great Gear Market, there'd be record stores, clothes stores, and one of them, Rusty Egan, I think, from the Rich Kids, he ran it. Used to see him running a record store on there in the 80s.
Well, the first people I met there were Jonathan and Eco, who started off in Specimen, didn't they? And then they ran a club called Feet First at Camden Palace, and they were every goth hotspot in London in the 80s, plying their wares.
But all of that, even this year, I've done a few bits and pieces and appearances down the King's Road, and each time I go down there, there's another building that's completely either gone or is behind scaffolding, and coming soon is some huge.
I know, that's
it
London.
really.
Yeah.
There's only one. It used to be nothing but pubs. There is one pub, and that's the great one, which is the Chelsea Potter. And if you've ever seen the wonderful Granada TV documentary from '68 called about the doors at the Roundhouse, so that's Jim Morrison and his record base. They come over. That's Camden, the Roundhouse. But you wouldn't find Jim in Camden. You'd find him in the windows of the Chelsea Potter, because the windows, it wraps around the corner of the street. And in those days, the seats would face outwards, so you could park yourself in the Chelsea Potter and just watch the whole parade going by. It was a very popular spot. And the guidebooks, the swinging line of guidebooks, actually recommended go and sit in the window of the Chelsea Potter, and you will see it all happening. And in recent years, they've turned their seats around. You can't actually do that anymore. The windows still on. But that's the only pub, even the World's End pub, which was there since the 17th century, that end of the King's Road, the whole district is named after that pub. In the last 2 years, that's closed. The building's still there. But, it's a hollowed out shell. It really is. But if you want to buy something desperately expensive, sorry.
So, if I got this right, your book kind of ends 1980?
No, 1979.
So it was about then that music started to move into the mainstream. You could read about popular music in the national press.
Yes, as opposed to the specific music press.
Yeah, otherwise it was NME, Sounds, Melody Maker, or whatever.
Record Maker,
So is that linked then to the fact that it changed?
I think so. I remember noticing that because the tabloids had the Pistols for breakfast. I mean, that was news because of the swearing, and they also thought, oh, somebody might be taking their clothes off here. We can get a photograph of this person. But really, in the 80s, Boy George used to tip the tabloids off.
Right.
I am going to be at this club. And then he'd complain about the paparazzi following him. He had rung them earlier that evening. And this was ringing the Sun and really people of that ilk. And of course that turned around and bit him a couple of years later, and they ran some horrible stories about him and his private life. But yeah, it was weird when I was a kid, you would not read the national papers and expect them, unless they were talking about the Beatles. Mostly it was the music press. Music press, no other country had it. The NME was selling 300,000 copies a week in 1973, and they were one of 5 national. I've met people when I worked at the Vintage magazine shop. we would get people coming in from Scandinavia, from Germany, saying, I'm looking for old copies of these music papers, because they were my lifeline in the 60s to find out what was going on.
Yeah.
They were actually having them imported very expensively, because there was nothing really to tell them.
Oh.
How are we doing for time?
9:03.
Simple question for both of you. First bands you saw?
The first proper gig I went to, apart from little local bands in Yarmouth, was the York Rock Festival in 1984. It was Echo and the Bunnymen, the Of Destiny, Sisters of Mercy, the Chameleons and the Redskins. That was a good enough start.
I'm older, so I was in Portsmouth. October 1975. I saw Dr. Phil with Wilco Johnson, and it just blew me away, absolutely destroyed me. That was touring their second album, Malpractice, and that's the tour that they recorded, and then the live album of it came out the following year, which was called Stupidity, by which time Wilco had left. I don't know, yeah, he might have still been with them, but then he left. I saw them again in '77 with their new guitarist, and then I saw Wilco solo, I think the same year, and it just wasn't the same, either of them. It was staggering how good they were. And British punk rock comes from many things, but the influence of early Feel Good was just, they were brutal and magnificent. So I got very lucky.
Are we going to have
question? It's a little bit complicated. As keen observers of past and I presume present music culture, to a degree, you start finished in 1979, and the arc that started politically in this country in '79 is kind of coming to the end of its travel, to a degree, one hopes.
Sure.
My question is, what do you guys have a view on whether the kids of today, whose future is affected very adversely by this entire scenario which we're in now, in this country, economically, politically, climatically, do you have a view on whether the kids are going to, there's an expression in music, or have they moved on to find ways of expressing their anger and disappointment elsewhere in process?
It feels completely atomised now. It feels fragmented in that when I was growing up, initially we had 2 television channels. That's what I got used to when we first had television. And then it's like, oh, big drama. Suddenly we've got a 3rd television channel. I remember that happening. And so if you wanted information about music in my teenage years, it was Top of the Pops, it was the old Grey Whistle Test if you're old enough to stay up to watch it. It was listening to John Peel 5 nights a week and reading The NME. And so you would go to school the following day, and if something had been on Top of the Pops, everybody had seen it. Everybody I knew had seen the same thing. So even if you didn't like something, if you had no time for the sort of things that were on top of it was such a mixture. Terry Wogan doing the floral tones alongside literally with the Brick House and Rouse Street.
Magic moment.
But that would be on.
1980 wasn't it?
I think it was earlier than that. But the point is, that so many. So many collisions, basically, that they would, 1 minute you would have, I don't know, Mud doing something, but then you might have Focus from Holland or Golden Earring or something like that. And then, but then you would have some Philly soul, or it could be all over the place. But then some lovable old entertainer who was usually doing an end of the pier show kind of thing, but was friends with the BBC, so they've got a new knockabout single, and you'd get that. And so we knew who all of these people were. Even if you didn't like them, you knew who they were. Whereas now, the music audience is so, if you're into this, you can find it on the internet, you can find it through your specialist Facebook, or however you follow that. You don't need the mass media to tell you about it, and you can be happily pursuing that, while somebody else at your school or wherever, they could be into the modern day goth scene, a friend in our building, he's a modern goth DJ, and he flies around the world, literally, to DJ. He holds down 2 day jobs and does this. I don't know where he gets the energy. And he's got the best. If you're going to be his name's Nicholas, right? And he's got the best name for a goth DJ I've ever heard. He calls himself KV Nick now. That's pretty damn good. And the point is, the scene that he's about, he plays goth records, the modern goth records, and 90% of what he plays I've never heard of. Never heard of the people. I wouldn't recognise it as goth music, but that is, he goes and plays the huge German goth festivals that happen every year, where they're huge, massive audience. So it is, everybody's doing their own thing. So, and also music is not that important to some. It's possible to be a teenager, like my brother's kids or whatever. Music was not on their radar. You know, for me, all my pocket money went buying records. It was very, very important. And I think you can have other priorities now. It might be gaming, it might be all sorts of things I've never heard of. Like,
bring back the pirate radio stations of the 60s, I think.
Pardon me?
I said bring back the pirate radio stations.
Yeah, indeed. Well,
of the 60s.
obviously John Peel, he talked to me about that, and yeah, I mean, it was obviously Tony Bent's department who shut them all down and then opened up Radio 1, and that was John's entrance into respectability. But they were, swashbuckling days, very much so. And I get the impression that people felt that they were part of a select club, you know, tuning into this mysterious thing.
Yeah.
And
I had a crystal set with old 1940s earphones under the bed sheets.
And did you feel that this was something, because that's a key thing about that some of your parents wouldn't understand, maybe
they didn't know about it.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. I mean, it's that's what makes a youth enthusiasm, or why you become a fan of a certain band. You think they've got something. They've got the mystery of. I once interviewed a great scriptwriter for Hammer Films, a guy called Christopher Wicking. He wrote all sorts of films, great film, and other non-Hammer films like Screen and Screen Again. But he said to me, his entry into wanting to write horror films when he was a teenager, he blagged his way as a kid. He was way too young for it. But 1958, the great Christopher Lee, the first appearance was Dracula for Hammer. And he said, I got into the cinema and I thought, somewhere here, the mystery of life is going to be revealed. You know, these are the occult secrets of something, because it was an X-film and I think that's what you're looking for in a band or in a youth, you know, that sense of belonging.
Philosophy of goth,
this real, here is...
There is a philosophy behind it.
Which is what Iggy was saying about, you could see the Rolling Stones in those days and think, they can teach me things about life.
I can learn.
Yeah. And I certainly, the swagger of some of these bands were just the sense of humour. I mean, the Cramps, there was a whole series of albums that came out in the 80s just called Songs the Cramps Taught Us, and it rounded up the original versions of these garage and rockabilly and obscure things, you know, because it was another world they'd opened up to people. And I think a lot of people are, particularly if you're teenage, you're looking for...
Yeah, and as I say, I don't have kids of my own, but the teenagers I've met I talk to, they've definitely got their own secret world, which I found quite heartening, because they were almost eschewing the internet, because that was like the mainstream, boring beer boy world for them. So they were making their own fanzines again and things like that. So,
So there is hope,
There is hope, definitely, definitely, there is.
The lesson I took from punk, being a teenage punk in the 70s, was not the let's go to McLaren and Westwood shop and spend the equivalent of £400 on a shirt, because their prices, you had to be rich to go and buy that stuff. Nobody I knew, none of the punks I knew, we made our own clothes. We went to charity shops, you ripped something up. It was the DIY thing. The famous phrase, Single by the Desperate Bicycles, that came with instructions on how to make your own record on the back and how much it cost. The phrase, it was easy, it was cheap, go and do it. Basically, do something for yourself. And that was an inspirational message to have when you're still at school and thinking, I might one day want to do something. Just encouraging people.
Because, when I saw people like Susie and Lydia and Poison Ivy, I thought, they're saying, you can do this. You know, you don't have to be big.
Very liberating.
You know.
And T.V. Smith from the adverts, I asked him if he ever had any Westwood McLaren stuff. He said no, we couldn't afford that stuff at all. And he's in one of the famous punk bands that's on Stiffen. He said you can't buy a revolution off a clothes hanger. And he said if you take one piece of clothing and you just rip off one sleeve or write a slogan on the back, suddenly it's yours. It's not. And funny enough, writing the TED book, there's a great memoir by Tom Jones, who was a teenage Ted in South Wales. And he didn't have any money, and he was still at school, but he managed to get this jacket that had been his dad's, and it didn't fit properly. And Ted jackets are supposed to come down almost to your knees, and it's fingertip length jacket, that's the problem. But they have velvet collars. And then he got a job working in a glove factory, just a little shed basically. But they had some velvet. So he nicked some velvet from this glove factory, took it home, and got his mum to sew it on the collar of this over. And he said this transformed it. Suddenly, it is no longer this old jacket of my dad's that looks like rubbish and doesn't fit me. It's too big for me. Suddenly, and I can quote this word for word as how he wrote it. It's like, suddenly I'm a jiving, thriving, 6-foot-tall teddy boy. You better fucking watch it. That's how he felt walking down the street, because he customised this just enough.
It's a psychobilly, one piece at a time drapes.
Yeah.
It's like brilliant.
But it's that impulse, I think, it runs through all of these youth movements and wanting to dress up. And also that once forming a band, most people I know who've ever formed a band have done it at the stage where they could barely play an instrument. And I'm still at that stage, and many years of that. But the point is, Tongue told you didn't need to be an impresario. You didn't need to have gone to the Royal College of Music or something. All the prog bands, it was, he's a classically trained musician.
Don't get onto prog now.
No. All I mean is, the enemy would tell you, they would try and tell you, this is a great band, because so-and-so went to the Royal College and he's done years of learning. It's like, well, sometimes music can sound good just with banging two pots together and somebody playing who can barely play, basically. And that's, and you also, the more you play, sometimes, not always, you learn how to do it. You learn it by doing it. So don't be scared to get on the stage, is what Punk was saying. Sorry, I don't know if we've still got any time.
I think this is a really bad segue, but are we going to have some more music?
I don't think so. I don't.
I think we're just about out of time.
I think we're pretty much out. It was just intended to be a little
taster.
A moose booster.
You have brought some records with you if you want to like to take.
I just got a
somehow.
couple of copies of that, but.
You have got them available though, haven't you? Yeah.
Just
so
literally two or three.
A little bit of Max home with you.
Yeah, that's a limited edition.
Terry Wogan, number 1, January 1978.
There you go. So we were both in the right.
That Goth masterpiece.
Yeah. Which is the year that you could tune in and see the Buzzcocks and the Stranglers on Top of the Pops in '78. That was a great year for seeing punk bands on Top of the Pops. And indeed the Ramones. I actually happened to be in New York about a week or two after Joey Ramone died, and they had a memorial gig for him. And that was a real lesson in how culture doesn't necessarily spread, because the Ramones obviously, New York, very important. Across America, not so much. So one person after another got on stage, and it was a big gig. Blondie played. The Damned flew over at their own expense at very short notice. But all these American musicians going, yeah, the Ramones, great band, Joey, wonderful. What a shame you never heard his songs on the radio, you couldn't move Décharné as a punk rocker on Radio 1 in the summer of '77. You know, over here, they were much, much bigger than they ever were in America. And punk was localized in New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and a few other places outside of that. The big things were elsewhere. Anyway, I'm rambling, so maybe.
Well, Nate, thanks everyone for coming tonight, and thanks for having me at your beautiful pub. And
thank you indeed.
May I ask you one question? Is that a Johnny Kidd pirate man? That Toby Jugger? Is it Johnny Kidd? The pirate Toby Jug? I've been looking at him the whole time. He needs a live patch, but yeah. He's one of Max's, and mine, favourite people.
Long John Silver.
Oh, put an eye patch on him and call him Johnny Kidd. Thank you, everybody.
We should also mention that Waterstones in town. We know they've got copies of Cathy's book and my book because we went in there this afternoon. And so, being natural vandals, we signed them. We scribbled on them. So, should you be looking for them?
Thank you. Thank you.